I don't know why I didn't make this video ages ago. Pride, I guess. See, I get offended by people saying, you're too legalistic about the teachings of Jesus. God just wants us to get the spirit of what Jesus said. Then they add something about Jesus being prone to exaggerating. So I get the feeling it's pretty much an attack on Jesus. And unfortunately, that has caused me to react against it by discarding their arguments altogether. Well, it's about time I stopped overreacting and addressed the truth in what they're saying. The truth is that getting the spirit of what Jesus taught is exactly what we need to be doing, all of us. Furthermore, Jesus really did exaggerate at times. And finally, being legalistic about things, he said, is not a good thing. Legalism will either end up making us hypocrites or end up making us give up in despair. I believe Jesus meant what he said. I'm not backing down from that. But it's possible to distort what he said by being too one-eyed as well. So I'm going to cover some of that in this video. Brace yourselves for a fairly different voice in the desert than what some of you are used to. Let's start with the exaggerations. I first got to thinking about this when I was gathering notes on some of the teachings of Jesus that I have a little trouble with personally, whether it's trouble understanding them or trouble trying to obey them. One of the teachings that has me stumped is what he said about giving to the poor and doing it secretly. Fundraising as such is pretty much out of the question, based on Jesus saying not to let anyone know what you're doing when you help the poor. But what about a situation where someone gives you a large sum of money and asks you to use it to help someone in a third world country? This happens a lot in Christian communities where someone in a wealthy country wants to do something for people in poorer countries. It's inefficient for them to go there themselves to spend the funds. So they ask one of us who's living in such a country to help them out. Do the people who've been given the task of delivering the money or the goods to the poor refuse to tell the donors about what they've done? Must people blindly trust that their money is being spent wisely in an age when there's scams all over the internet? Or should someone go against what Jesus said about keeping charitable work secret? This matter of being accountable to donors is a dilemma that I was considering when the subject of exaggerations came up. You see, the dilemma is even more restrictive when you understand that Jesus said that people who give the actual money or food or whatever to the poor should do it in such a way that even they don't know what they did. Now that's really secret. But how is it even possible? See, Jesus said, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Now, I may be missing something here, but that does sound like an exaggeration to me. How can I do anything useful in terms of helping the needy if my left hand doesn't know what my right hand is doing? So if Jesus was exaggerating, and to be honest, I think he was, why? Why did he do that? And what bearing does such an exaggeration have on discerning the real spirit of what he was saying? Now, I think much of the problem comes from our most common understanding of the word exaggerate. People usually exaggerate to make themselves look better than they are, or they exaggerate to make their opponents look worse than they are. Exaggerating is not usually regarded as a good thing. It's a kind of nasty form of dishonesty. And it does seem to me that critics of what Jesus taught are happy to let people make that assumption about Jesus. In other words, they imply that Jesus was prone to exaggerating, so you really can't take anything he said very seriously. I mean, heaven itself might just be an exaggeration. So can you see why I've overreacted and stuck my fingers to my ears when they said this? However, there is an interesting little word that makes all the difference. That word is hyperbole. It's a special form of literary exaggeration that has a very real purpose. And in fact, when you see it for what it really is, it can make a point even clearer than it would have been without the hyperbole. Let me give you a couple of common examples. First, have you ever heard someone talk about giving 110% towards something that they want very badly? It could be a coach asking for 110% from the team. It could be a student telling how hard they've worked toward getting a good grade. It could be a parent bragging about how much effort a son or daughter puts into anything they choose to do. Obviously, it is an exaggeration, but it's not done to deceive. It's done quite openly to get across to you that they are serious about giving 100%. or at least about getting as close as they possibly can get to 100%. You see, the spirit of that exaggeration is to make you take any mention of 100% a lot more seriously and literally than you might be inclined to think if they just said, give it all you've got. It's more like, give it all you've got and then give a little bit more. What if you were assigned a task and you ask the boss when it needs to be finished? Have you ever heard someone say, I want it finished yesterday? Of course, that too is an exaggeration. It's another example of a hyperbole. It's saying that if it could have been finished by yesterday, that would not have been too soon. It's already overdue. No matter how soon you finish the project, it's still going to be late. So ask yourself, what is the spirit of such a hyperbole? Is it saying that you can pretty well sort it out yourself as to how long you'd like to take to finish the project? Or is the spirit of the exaggeration that the person making the assignment wants you to do it absolutely as fast as you possibly can, more or less immediately? So, even if what Jesus meant when he said not to let your left hand know what your right hand is doing is impossible, it's not because he wouldn't want to see you literally do that if you could. That is, hide a good deed from yourself. In fact, when you get the spirit of the exaggeration, sometimes you even discover that the exaggeration may not be so totally impossible as you thought it was. In a minute, I'm going to show that with the left-hand, right-hand illustration. Now, I've never preached on humility because I've always said that a truly humble person would never know that they were humble anyway, and that humility is just a byproduct of something else. It's a byproduct of our love for God and others. A truly humble person would be so focused on the good in other people that just doing something like giving to the poor, even if it's everything they own, will be virtually forgotten a moment after it's been done. You would never hear about it because they would have forgotten they did it. Peter, for example, is recorded as having asked Jesus, "Who then can be saved?" when it became clear that Jesus was asking people to give up everything they owned. And then it suddenly dawned on Peter, hey, we have done that. He and the other apostles had done exactly that. It just hadn't seemed heroic to them at the time because they were so excited about following Jesus. But most of us don't do that, do we? If we show even the slightest generosity or kindness, we picture ourselves as being pretty good guys, and we secretly hope, if we're honest, that others will take notice and feel the same. Maybe we just straight out tell others what we've done because we think they should know, and it'll convince them that we're true Christians. I often say to people who write to me that I can tell from what they say that they've never seriously considered obeying Jesus. They usually think it's presumptuous of me to say such a thing, but the hints are everywhere. And one of the most glaring hints is when they tell me that they do a lot of good things for the poor. I'm not putting them down for helping the poor, but I actually feel sorry for them because they obviously didn't do it for Jesus, or they would have honored his conditions, which are that they not tell anyone else about it. So my point is that keeping one side of our brain ignorant of what the other side of the brain did may not be as impossible as it sounds. Giving could become so instinctive that we don't even give it a second thought. That should be the ideal. Now, before I move on to my next illustration of hyperbole, I want to say something about the grace of God. When we get the real spirit of what Jesus was saying, including the spirit behind the hyperbole, we soon discover that virtually all of us fall short of literally obeying what Jesus was saying. This is how the grace of God is so fundamentally linked to obedience to the teachings of Jesus. You're never going to get it right, not perfectly. You will forever be forced back to the foot of the cross, begging God for forgiveness for having fallen short. In this case, the Spirit was about not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Sure, literally, legalistically, it's impossible. But the spirit of what he was saying was to do everything in our power to get close to that. Keep our charitable works as secret as possible from as many people as possible, including ourselves and the recipients. When we get that clear, and when we're honest about how little we really have done that, it soon becomes apparent that we've fallen short of God's perfection. And so we need the grace and the forgiveness of God to make up the shortfall in our limited righteousness. I'm not saying this so we can throw our hands in the air and give up. I'm saying it because I think we should try and try and try until we come as close to perfection as we possibly can. And I believe that it is through this trying that we will begin to really appreciate what the grace of God is all about. Far from making us self-righteous, any honest attempt to obey Jesus is going to make us recognize our need for His grace to make up the huge shortfall between our best and His perfection. Now, something I've noticed a lot about so-called Christian charity is that we feel we haven't done our job until we preached a sermon. Kind of made the recipient feel beholding to the good Christian folk who gave them that loaf of bread. Like if we left it anonymously, they might think it came from a Muslim or an atheist. But in keeping with the spirit of what Jesus was saying, I don't even think the recipient needs to know the history of what happened. What the church needs today is not more recognition from the world for all the good that we do. What we need is more recognition from God for all the good that we've been successful in hiding. Let's try to get on God's good side by keeping things more secret. Jesus said in one place, "When you've done everything that I've told you to do, then say, 'We are unprofitable servants.'" In other words, let's forget about what we've done by looking at how far short of what He's actually told us to do we still are. Now I'm going to look at another possible example of exaggeration. In the King James Version of the Bible, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Take no thought for food or clothing." It's pretty extreme, isn't it? I mean, can you pour yourself a bowl of cornflakes without thinking about what you're doing? Can you put on a pair of pants without thinking about the pants? Most translations have softened it to something like, "Don't worry about food or clothing," or "Do not take anxious thoughts about where you will get your food and clothes." But once again, if you get the spirit of the most extreme phrase, the one that sounds like an exaggeration, don't even think about it, you'll do your best to push financial concerns right out of your mind, while you focus, as Jesus went on to say, on building God's kingdom and seeking His righteousness. In the little communities that are associated with this channel, people do not do fundraising. They do not grow crops or make things to sell. They do not work for money. As much as possible, they try to take no thought for food and clothing. Most of our funds come as gifts, often directly linked to our preaching the gospel. I can't think of anything we do for the express purpose of making money. But it hasn't stopped us from planning at times, based on assumptions about donations and other things. Even that little act of planning can easily grow into worries or anxious thoughts, as some have translated the passage I just quoted. So it pays to minimize all thoughts of any sort with regard to material needs, so that we can put our full attention into just building the kingdom of God and seeking His righteousness. But there's a third argument that I've tended to ignore in the past, which I would like to discuss in relation to this second illustration. It's the argument against legalism. I've been accused of being too literal in preaching what Jesus preached, of being legalistic about it. Well, the argument for me was the easiest one to dismiss because it could be used against almost anything. If we believe in a real hell, is that legalistic? If we believe that stealing is a sin, is that legalistic? If we believe Jesus is literally going to return to earth, is that legalistic? Nevertheless, I have over the years encountered a devilish sort of legalism, which pops up soon after someone has pushed through all the arguments to living by faith and started to live by faith themselves. Suddenly, the devil becomes an expert on precisely what we must or must not do to live by faith. Every week I get letters from someone telling me that I have no business talking about Forsaking All if I have a computer on which to record my videos, or if someone else has given one to me, I should have refused it because that person must have worked for money to get it. This last week I heard a couple of trolls on a religious chat site arguing that Forsaking All means everything, including anything God gives you back after you've forsaken all, because all is all, and it doesn't change after your initial forsaking all. So how do I answer that one? Most of the time, when I share the conditions under which my wife and I actually live, people kindly accept it as reasonable. But I also know that we live much more comfortably than a large proportion of the Earth's population even now. So does their endorsement really mean anything anyway? Or to use a little common sense, that's another one of those phrases I've grown to hate because of how it's used to negate so much of what Jesus said. But to use a little common sense, what we need to look at is the bigger picture. Do I, or the people I influence, really need to be perfect before we can preach obedience to the teachings of Jesus? Isn't there, in fact, room for us to fall short of some demonic form of legalism that aims only to smash all faith in what Jesus most clearly taught? I feel confident that what is happening on this channel at the moment is of truly historic importance. A tiny handful of people are starting to approximate, if you like, the teachings of Jesus to a degree that may have never happened before in church history. Like Jesus and his 12 apostles, we do have a bag with money in it. We do have enough funds to buy a sword if he should tell us to do so. We do occasionally stay in houses which have been made available for us. And we only occasionally go out like what happened when Jesus sent 70 of his followers out for a brief period of time, without money, without a change of clothes, ready to sleep out in the open, in order to demonstrate God's presence in a stronger way than what we live out most of the time in our fairly comfortable RVs or rented rooms. You see what I'm getting at here? It's kind of a common sense approach, balanced with the extreme approach that I've been talking about up to this point. Sure, there's much more that we could be doing, but if we had waited until we had it all perfectly nutted out, would we have gotten anywhere? I believe it is because we have tried to take Jesus as literally as possible that our lives have been radically transformed. Not because we succeeded in getting it perfect. Common sense tells me it's better to have a shot at perfection and achieve something than it is to do nothing because I haven't yet worked out how to do it perfectly. Now, if you know someone else who's doing it, say, without money or without computers or without a lot of the things that we think God has given us, please tell us about them. We're open to learning from anyone, anywhere, who is trying to get closer to the extreme. But if you just want to tell me that God doesn't expect us to try, that the spirit of the rule is to do nothing and to live our lives the same as the world around us, that everything Jesus said was just crazy exaggerations, well, I'm not really interested. Someone has said it's better to love and lose than never to have loved at all. It's like that in our relationship with God. I don't believe that the 12 apostles, not even after the day of Pentecost, ever achieved sinless perfection. But I believe they tried, and in doing so, they turned the world upside down. They didn't have to be perfect to do that. However, I think the Apostle Paul discovered things that the other 11 had missed. So he was able to lead the church a few steps closer to perfection. But neither did Paul ever achieve perfection. See, we don't need to do it like the Muslims do with Muhammad, where they say he was the most perfect prophet that ever lived. There will never be anyone else who can add anything to what he taught. No, because it's not Paul or Peter or James or John that we're following. We can all move closer to what Jesus taught, even closer than they were, if we will open ourselves up to further revelation from God, especially as it appears in the 4 Gospels. We will never achieve perfection either, but I think we're getting closer through one very simple little adjustment. We stopped looking for perfection in anyone else, and we started looking for it in Jesus. It is the very act of trying to obey Jesus perfectly that finds me broken and lost, overwhelmed with my need for God's amazing grace to have any hope of making it to heaven. I just praise God that He's made a way for me to be forgiven for all those times that I fall short. But that's not a license to disobey Jesus. It is instead a license to get out there and give it my best shot, assured that even when I do fall short, His grace makes up the difference. I can approach the task almost recklessly, unlike the brother who wrote to me this week saying, well, when it comes to obeying Jesus, I can't be too cautious. I want to be sure that this is what God is telling me to do at this point in my life. Until I have absolute clarity on that, I will continue my university studies, continue to do what my parents tell me, and continue to fit in the best I can in my local church. Oh, God help us. Is that what it means to get the spirit of what Jesus was saying? Heck no. It's the exact opposite. And it comes from a fundamentalist mentality, the absolute worst form of legalism, where someone says, if I can't do it perfectly, I won't do anything. The servant who buried his talent for fear of making a mistake was of that mentality. If I remember correctly, he was cast into outer darkness where there's weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Is that what you want? I try to use a bit of common sense in an effort to get the overall spirit of what Jesus taught. It's opened up some radical doors for me and some of my friends. Consequently, we now teach people everywhere to get the spirit of quitting your jobs, get the spirit of selling your possessions, and get the spirit of moving in with other Christians who are doing the same, like the first Christians did, literally, in the book of Acts. You don't have to do it perfectly, but he does expect you to do your best to approximate it. Now listen closely as I summarize what I've said in this video, because the actual outline's a bit confusing, and the reason for that is I was working my way through 2 short lists at the same time. Not sure if you picked that up. I looked at 3 or maybe 4 valid arguments that I've tended to ignore in the past. They were the argument that A, we need to get the spirit of what Jesus was saying. B, Jesus exaggerates at times. And C, legalism can destroy the spirit of what Jesus was saying. If you want a 4th one, it could be the need for us to use a little more D, common sense, and following through with our obedience to Jesus, especially with regard to specific details. Now, while I was working through those arguments, I arrived at 3 very important lessons that appear when you start putting those other arguments together. I found that 1, exaggerations, as Jesus used them, actually help us to see more clearly that the spirit of what Jesus said really was for us to be extreme in obeying him. I also found that 2, trying to obey Jesus and being honest about how far short of perfection we fall when we do is a constant reminder of our need for forgiveness. Praise God that Jesus made this forgiveness possible through his sacrificial death on the cross. And finally, I observed that 3, common sense shows us that we don't have to be defensive about some of the many blessings that God has given us in this overall life of simplicity. Perfect or not, we are closer to the spirit of what Jesus taught than we would have been if we had waited until we were perfect before we started. So in closing, if you'd like to learn more about such a lifestyle from people, many of whom have been doing it for decades, please contact me at the email address on the screen so we can share our knowledge and experience with you. We don't have all the answers, but hopefully we can inspire you to get the overall spirit of what Jesus came to show us about the kingdom of heaven. Thank you.